brands are like systems trying to find a way to talk to humans. Power trying to find a way to talk to people. Art is how people talk to other people about systems. So maybe that's the definition of an artist within all of this. An artist is somebody who is trying to express a thought or an idea or a message to other human beings about the state of the world that systems have created.
Hi, Onika. Welcome to Changing Shapes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us again.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so happy to have you on the podcast and so happy for you to share with us your position on artist strategy. Leading into the show, maybe just as a brief reintroduction for anybody who hasn't heard the first episode with you, could you give a quick introduction to who you are?
I decided really early on, literally the first week of my career, to not be loyal to any specific company or discipline, but actually to grab as many different roles as possible, always as a strategist, but feeding into as many different creative contexts as possible. It was a little bit like the Pokemon game, kind of catch them all. I have almost 25 years experience as a researcher and strategist, classically trained in big global corporate agencies, but my career has like a nice, neat cut in the middle.
You've really helped define my view of what a strategist is, because having observed how you work, it feels like when you come into a collaboration with a business, you just have this laser vision of like, okay, this is everything that's going on. This is what I can see. And you can actually describe, well, this and this and this are the steps that need to be done. And it isn't just about advertising. It goes so much deeper in terms of the inside of the business. And the way that you describe your collection of experiences, I understand now why your approach is like that.
You know, I studied philosophy, which is, you know, it's just the skill of asking questions. And so going into the world of corporate strategy, the program that I started out in, which was the WPP Marketing Fellowship, I was attracted to it literally because the tagline was ambidextrous brains required. And I was like, that's me. And so the purpose of the program was to actually produce holistic thinkers who would not skew a client's focus towards their expertise just because they wanted that budget. So to sit with a client and not say the answer is marketing or the answer is a new product or the answer is, you know, is to actually sit with the client, get into their shoes and just ask questions about what success looks like, and to be tool agnostic, platform agnostic, you know, even resources agnostic. I realized the thing that fascinates me most is decision making, the science behind human decision making. On one level, we're animals, we're instinctive, we're instinct led, but you know, we're also evolved to a certain extent, and decision making is something that's, you know, at the root of capitalism. It's the root of all commerce, right? How we live our lives. So I got into the world of advertising thinking, this is a direct line. Look at me. I thought I wasn't studying something vocational, but I've managed to find a job that pays me to be myself. This is amazing. And then cognitive dissonance started to come in. You know, a few years into my career, I realized that a lot of the creative work that I was informing wasn't really geared to serve human decision-making or human needs or human desires. It was geared to actually just kind of influence or change that for a corporate objective. Back in Brooklyn, I was living in New York City, all my friends, absolutely all of them, were either musicians or hackers or writers. So and artists too, actually, fine artists too. So, you know, I'm surrounded by all these people who are actually struggling to make ends meet. I had a kind of glitzy corporate job, you know, Madison Avenue, New York City. And then I would go back to Brooklyn and I would basically sit down and have really cheap Chinese food with people who were trying to figure out like how to live as an artist, whether any of their hacking experiments were worth anything. I began to start applying the strategic thought that I was using during the day to my friends' lives. And to me, it looked really simple. It was just find your relevance, find the place in the world, the person in the world, the context in the world that will appreciate what you're doing and will understand. Even if they don't understand it, they'd be curious enough about it to support you in making more. And so I started to do that with my friends who are artists, my friends who are hackers. 3 of them invented MakerBot. And it literally started as an experiment in the NYC Resistors loft space in, Gowanus, Brooklyn. I realized I'm basically sitting on a bridge between two completely different worlds, but I feel like they belong together because the value that I bring works in both places. That was the seed of me thinking that art and branding should be closer together.
I think you mentioned asking the right questions, but I think one thing I noticed with you is that it goes beyond that, because you have this broad sense of everything that's going on. So you're asking the right questions for the specific business or person you're working with, but you're putting it into a much broader context. And some of the things I remember is I frequently think of you. We had a conversation about 10 years ago where you were saying things. This was just, it was about 2016. And you were pointing out a few things about what's kind of going on
Big year.
Culturally, going on in the tech space, going on with various sort of people influencing the space that we're in. And at the time I thought, I know you and I know you have a unique view, but I was like, that sounds like a lot. Like, I don't know. Let's see. Not that I didn't believe you. I was like, where are you getting this from? And the thing that is that I think of frequently is it's pretty much exactly the things that you were like, we should worry about this. Some of the things that we should have worried about then have transpired. And no, I didn't talk to anybody else who was seeing that. And that's the thing that I've noticed with you talking with businesses and with, in the context of everything else that's happening, is that you see things the way they're set up and the way they're going more in advance than most people that I talk to.
I have hunches. I have to drop a massive dollop of humility in there. I have hunches. Yeah. It was really ingrained into me at a very early age that being able to express ideas clearly and articulate your value in any specific situation is the only way you're going to survive in this world and the only way you're going to achieve all the things that you deserve. You deserve them and we love you very much. But the only way the world is going to recognize you is if you can communicate. Grandparents arrived in London and they had to learn how to defend their humanity, right? And then how to project their aptitude for jobs, and then how to show that they're actually excellent at those jobs so that they could be promoted and get a mortgage and get their kids into good schools. And so, the power of clear and careful and impressive communication was really ingrained into my parents and then into me. And it's not just me, it's the entire community that I know. That's something that's just kind of been a baseline for us.
So moving to artist strategy, I want to talk about that because my background in fine art, having studied it, I thought, this is interesting. What is it? So could you give for somebody who's never heard about it? And I think it's also quite a loaded, there's loaded words, right? Like we all think we know what art is and we know what strategy is.
I think about art in three different ways. There's artwork, right? There is something that is produced or performed, somehow cognized. And then there's art praxis, which I've spoken to you about as an artist, right? There's the methods and the approach and the processes and actually the systems that artists generate for themselves so that they can produce artwork. And then there's the history of art. There's art history, there's art criticism. There's like thousands, if not millions of articles and ideas that have been, codified and archived to dive into. So when I think about art, I think about these three worlds, and each one has a strategic purpose for what I'm talking about.
Can you give us some examples of where this worked?
Yeah.
And, both in terms of where it worked from artists and artwork, as well as specific projects or partners, because I understand what you mean, but I couldn't quite repeat it because I can't quite imagine a specific one.
So an example of where, artwork has been strategic that I've curated is for the BMW Foundation. They had a Responsible Leaders Forum, which is their biggest event of the whole year. And I was, lucky enough, we'll talk about luck separately, but I was lucky enough to be invited to curate interventional art for this event. Now, on the surface, the event is a conference, closer to 500 attendees here in Berlin, a mix of responsible leaders that includes, eminent leaders, eminent business leaders, politicians, economists, everybody who calls themselves a responsible leader in that network. Now, it's a foundation. It's not a corporation. So that gives them some permission to play. And they speak as an organization about social capital and have many artists in their network. So the prospect of interventional art being part of the program wasn't, and it had never been done before, but it wasn't an alien concept. What I decided to do with the organizers, like shoulder to shoulder, peer to peer, was curate a program that helped everyone in the event to remember why they're there as a human being. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, a little bit of context for my opinion on conferences. I think you know this as a friend. I detest them. I don't like conferences. The broader theme that I dislike is the distance in the corporate world, the distance between the dichotomy that I described, communities and commercial success. It's been a long-held career goal, big wish to bring something into a conference or conferencing context that can change the dynamic. And the dynamic that we wanted to change was, a passive audience, the amphitheater approach of 99 people sitting in the dark with one person on the stage. And so, that's like an ancient Greek amphitheater dynamic. And it leads to, passivity. It leads to people sitting in the dark, receiving information. Sometimes they feel more clever. Most of the time they don't, and nobody is moved to make a commitment. Nobody is moved, unless the speaker is absolutely electric and gives everybody, like a playbook of things to do next. Nobody's moved to do anything. So in that context, we created a kind of multi-layered artwork, which is a bit like a social sculpture. We had a team of artists. We just called ourselves Art Team. And we encouraged, through various different kind of art-led levers, we encouraged all participants to tell the truth about how they were feeling. It was a 3-day event, and we made sure everybody knew that their verbatim feelings were going to be projected onto a gigantic wall. We had a kind of roiling animated, I don't even know how to describe it. We had like a roiling animated, like colorful artwork on a gigantic wall in the rec room where everybody's like sipping coffee. And on day one, the honest answers were, this feels very typical for last year. These speaking points aren't very radical. But there was a lovely loop where people were sipping their coffee and looking at the wall and being like, well, I'm not the only one who thinks this. How do I say what I want to say? And we had human beings, we had an anonymous interfaces, or we had like face-to-face interfaces, depending on how bold and honest you feel. By day 3, it was pretty provocative stuff on the wall. And, and the funny thing is I'm not looking at the art because I know what the art says. I'm looking at the people, and the people are like, where can I, and so it was this lovely interactive for people who really were just kind of sitting in the dark for 3 days. It was an outlet for them to express their real human feelings and fears. There's a lot of fear and thoughts, to complain, to be dissenters, which has never happened in the history of this particular organization, to have live dissent at the event that everyone can see. But that was an example of interventional art and artwork providing a constructive disruption.
While I was studying, my main focus was relational aesthetics. So it very much relates to what you're talking about. Katarzyna Szera is a great example where she goes to spaces and does interventions that bring people together to say things that they wouldn't otherwise be saying, or even just may have conversations that they didn't have before. And I can, that really shifts the core of what we're all trying to do, is hopefully connect with each other or just exist within a space together. And it shifts how that connection happens and to what level it can.
Most businesses, ventures, and corporate organizations already have a model for growth. They already have a model for generating profit. I'm not trying to accelerate their growth or divert or skew their growth. What I'm trying to do explicitly is close the gap between their commercial impact and their community impact. A lot of ventures, they grow with capitalist metrics that are purely financial. And so the distance from how they're affecting communities grows. And they're taught to be fine with that because The community impact isn't something that affects their growth model or their operating model. So this is what tends to bring business leaders to the table. It's not that they're not growing and they want me to help them grow. It's that they are growing, but they are also noticing the distance between their commercial impact and their community impact. They want to resolve it because at the end of the day, businesses are systems that are also designed by humans, and human beings want to be good.
What you're describing isn't some painting that took 20 people 5 years to paint. It's not complex. It's just identifying this intervention that you can make that will have a huge impact, and how will it shift. And I think for, in your case, philosophy, in my case, art, that is what we learn. I'm also sure that it takes a specific type of artist to be open to this.
First of all, you're absolutely right. I think within every discipline, there is a mindset that is open versus not. I've had this trial by fire where I've had lots of kind of confrontational conversations that, to be honest, I wasn't prepared for. I have met enough artists who shared with me, really shared with me, and became good friends. And I learned what their intrinsic motivations are and where their training and their passions meet, and the thing that we all have in common is we want to save the world. We want to save the world. Yes, I've worked in all these, big corporate ecosystems with pretty scary clients, but I still have this belief that the infrastructure that human beings have built under the banner of capitalism, it can be repurposed and it can be reimagined. If you want to really make an impact in the world and in the future for everyone, you have to go in, and so what I'm trying to do is create meaningful and hopefully effective entry points for artists to go into commercial and corporate contexts.
I know you're multidisciplinarian.
Yeah.
You have a fantastic cultural background, being all over these places, and you've seen different cultures, different ways of working, and your set of experiences, as you described, is extremely broad. So could you explain to us on an example how you are part of this triangle? When you're engaging, what is your role? What are you doing how can I imagine, a Tuesday when you're doing this work?
I see my role as basically the water barrier, carrying water between capitalism and communities. Yeah. That function has been called lots of different things, depending on the context. I get called a facilitator, steward, a connector, the in-between, the bridge between these two worlds that can figure out a way to orchestrate them, together. I have been asked often how I got this job. How do I get this job? How do you end up here? I wrote.
So it's pretty clear that having that wealth of background and the multidisciplinary and understanding of the world is so helpful translating or being the water bearer between these two worlds.
Yeah.
Provocative question. Are artists specialists or generalists?
Both. There is no way I could choose one or the other. Artists are both. And this is big, right? And this is based on every artist I know personally, but also every artist I've ever taken the time to read about. Every artist, every human being, right? If you look at kids, we all start out as artists to a certain extent, although that will also get me in trouble in certain circles.
I would agree.
Every child has a flame, right? Every child has a flame inside them that gets bigger when you say something specific, right? And gets smaller when you don't say those things, right? And that's what artists have. So in that sense, everybody's a specialist at where their flame comes from, right? And as you know, the art school curriculum kind of forces you to dig into certain forms, certain disciplines more than others. I've been in a situation in Paris, actually, where I somehow ended up in a room with the Ministry of Defense. Or the Ministre de l'Intérieur, speak a little bit of French. And this was after the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attacks. And it was in anticipation of an Olympics bid, which we now know was successful, right? So I was in the room with them in 2016, that lovely year that we talked about earlier. And they were trying to design a defense system with my client, who was Cisco. They were trying to design a new form of defense using mobile telecom technology. They wanted to convene a cohort of companies that could basically design a responsive system to alert everybody in Paris, and more importantly, to send different messages to different groups of people. And the groups of people naturally were like residents, workers, tourists, commuters, different groups of people would need different instructions for where to go and for how long, and, maybe even different variations on why, right? And so I was there for a couple of days, in the workshop, really just happy to be there. Surrounded by, quite powerful and important, self-important people talking about what they know. And they're reached a point which was familiar to me. I'm remembering what you said at the beginning of the conversation about sometimes I have these hunches and I'm like, well, why isn't anybody more important having this hunch? So I waited, I sat on it for a few hours, this hunch, because I realized everybody was talking about what they knew, but not about how to connect what they knew. There's that moderator, facilitator, connector moment, but you have to overcome the biggest wave of imposter syndrome when you're sitting in a room with people who are like twice your age and, decorated in their field, right? Because I'm a generalist. I'm not a specialist in anything. And so there came that moment because I was daydreaming and looking up there while we're talking about all these different people. I'm looking at the people out the window and I'm looking from a 20-story office building in Isimulanu, right? I'm looking at the people and I remembered this artwork I saw like years ago and it was called a social sculpture, right? And this guy, this man, this artist whose name I can't remember, but I will give you afterwards. He had basically given 1,000 people pieces of paper as they were coming out of a station. And everybody read that piece of paper. And it was a very simple instruction just to do something different, one thing differently. And he had cameras and he had created a social sculpture just by handing out paper, right? And we're with Bouygues Telecom. And they have the ability to send messages to every single mobile phone in Paris. And I just had this idea of just like, this guy could probably help us. But he's thought about how to get different groups of people with different colorful pieces of paper to do things in a synchronized way without knowing what everybody else is looking at. Like, he could probably help, right? After 3 hours, after 3 hours getting nowhere, I made the suggestion and they brought the guy in and it was amazing.
Wow.
Yeah. So I got to go back 2 months later, to Gare du Nord and Gare de l'Est, Gare de Montparnasse with the dude. And he just showed them what he does. And then it was interpreted.
Do you know the specifics of what he showed and what the shift was?
Well, he showed them his praxis. The thing about art praxis is you kind of mentioned it before. It's about asking questions. It's about being open to what form the answers may take. Yeah. And it's not always about engineering a spectacle, but the actual engagement was the giving. For him, it was about the giving.
Right.
And if he happened to engineer a spectacle, it didn't matter to him. But obviously, the spectacle was the reason why the innovation cohort came to him. When I was sitting in the boardroom before I made my suggestion, we had all these specialists, like I said, highly decorated specialists speaking sometimes in French about what they knew. And none of them were talking about the actual on the street experience of getting off the train and hearing a siren and then having your phone go off and then overcoming all the physiological effects of panic to follow an instruction. Whereas the artist understood because part of his praxis was making sure that when he intervenes in somebody's journey, he's not scaring them, he's not inviting them, he's not. Artist thinks about the human being that they want to engage. The artist thinks about the giving moment, whereas the business thinks about the outcome, the outcome, the output safety, public safety. And it's just that kind of asymmetric, imbalanced perspective that just needed to be.
Because it's not, the specialists will tell you this is the information that people need to know, but they don't understand how the person will be able to take it.
The touch point.
Yes.
Yeah, the touch point. And it's, we have all these capabilities. We can send a message. We can send a message to every single mobile phone in Paris. Okay, but what are you going to say?
Exactly.
We're going to say, alert, pay attention, do not panic. Yeah, that was a moment of using art praxis. And, like I said, this journey for me has been very organic. I began to think about, okay, there's something about the way artists work. I love the word praxis. The way artists work is, it's not just about the medium, it's not just about the clay or the paper, although there's a lot of thinking and a lot of thought about like the materials that you're working with, which is very similar to design. But it's really about the engagement. It's about the first touch.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas businesses tend to think about the last touch, artists tend to think about the first touch. And I will also say that artists are some of the most entrepreneurial human beings I've ever met.
With what you're doing, if you got a, let's say, 10 million euro investment, how would you use it in order to maybe bring this to more artists?
I would invest in hybrid programming. I would either bring VCs and art schools together, or I would create a hybrid program that could go into all creative education institutions. And for the sole purpose of bringing entrepreneurship and artistry together. Yeah. Because artists can become entrepreneurs, but newsflash, most entrepreneurs could never be artists. But I've noticed in my work that a lot of foundations and VCs are trying to kind of retroactively bring creative people into social innovation. That they're trying to make that happen. And I think a more radical way to do it, radical meaning at the root, would be to invest in a hybrid education so that everything the entrepreneurs get, the artists get too. But the people who would benefit most would be the entrepreneurs.
Winding up, I'm asking everybody this question. I find today the world is on fire. AI is changing everything.
Yes.
We're not going to have jobs. We might not even exist. We're not going to connect with people because we'll all be stuck on our computers. This is all the stuff that's what's coming at us. And it's all feels hopeless.
Yeah.
Now, I resist that. So what I'm asking everybody in this current season is, if you imagine things not going wrong, but you imagine them going right.
Yes.
If you imagine that, what do you see?
I might make you cry, Tom.
That's okay.
Do you remember the end of Monsters, Inc.?
Yes.
Sure.
Did you watch the Pixar movie, Monsters Inc., Monsters Incorporated? So it's one of my favorite movies. I cannot watch it through to the end without bursting into tears. So the monsters have this academy and they are trained to harvest screams. Yeah, I think about this a lot. They're trained to harvest children's screams.
Yeah.
And through a 2-hour movie, it transpires that the energy that they've been collecting, like industrial, literally industrial energy connectors, the energy from screams is not as potent as the energy of laughter. So they've been deliberately terrorizing children for hundreds of years when they could have been making them laugh. And it completely reimagines the infrastructure of the academy. They go from, rah, to like clown noses, right? And this is what I think about when I think about my work with corporations. Yeah. All they have to do is realize that they get the same profit from making things better. They get more profit because we'll be here longer. Yeah. If all the fossil fuel companies and plastics manufacturers and fast food, fast fashion, if all of those categories reimagine their existing infrastructure, their existing ecosystems, and decide to play the longer game, the cleaner game, that's what happens when everything goes right. And that's my childish wish.